The Young and the Restless spoilers. The sterile smell of the hospital filled the air as Nick Newman sat in the dimly lit room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, his eyes fixed on the unconscious form of his daughter, Faith. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines monitoring her vital sign. Next to her, Lucy lay motionless as well, both girls victims of the horrific car accident that had turned their world upside down. The fear that had gripped Nick's heart since the accident was suffocating, but he held on to a single desperate hope: they would both wake up. Then, as if by a miracle, Faith stirred. Nick's breath caught in his throat as her eyelids fluttered and a soft groan escaped her lips. He was by her side in an instant, his hand gently clasping hers. "Faith? Sweetheart, can you hear me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. Beside her, Lucy's eyes opened as well, blinking in confusion as she took in her surroundings. Relief washed over Nick like a tidal wave as he saw both girls coming back to life. "Thank God," he breathed, voice thick with emotion. Sharon, who had been standing quietly in the corner, rushed to her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face. But as Faith's eyes focused on the faces around her, something was terribly wrong. Instead of the relief and recognition Nick had hoped for, there was only confusion. Blank, uncomprehending confusion. She looked from one face to the next, her brows furrowing as if she were trying to place who these people were. Failing. "Dad?" he finally said, her voice weak and uncertain, as if she wasn't even sure of the word. Nick's heart sank as he realized what was happening. Faith didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize Sharon or the room they were in. She didn't recognize anything at all. "Faith, it's me, Dad. It's okay, you're safe," Nick said gently. The look in her eyes told him that his words weren't reaching her. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to clear the fog that clouded her mind. The confusion only deepened. Sharon's hand flew to her mouth as she realized the same thing Nick had. "Oh my God, Nick, she doesn't remember us," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the realization. The doctor, who had been monitoring the situation from the doorway, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Mr. Newman, Mrs. Newman, I think we need to run some additional tests," he said calmly, though there was a note of urgency in his voice. "Faith has suffered a significant head injury, and it's possible that the trauma has caused temporary or even permanent memory loss." Nick nodded numbly, his mind struggling to process the doctor's words. Temporary? Permanent? The idea that Faith might never regain her memories was too painful to bear, but he knew they had to face the reality of the situation. Faith was alive. The girl they knew and loved might be lost to them, at least for now. As the medical team prepared to take Faith for further tests, Lucy, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, suddenly spoke up. "It's my fault," she said, her voice trembling with guilt. "I'm the reason this happened. If I hadn't—" "Lucy, no," Sharon interrupted, placing a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. "This isn't your fault. It was an accident, and no one blames you." But Lucy shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, you don't understand. I was the one who distracted Faith. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm so sorry." The pain in Lucy's voice was palpable, and Nick felt his heart break for her as well. She was just a child, caught up in a tragedy that no one could have predicted. But there was no time to dwell on it now. They needed to focus on Faith, on getting her the help she needed. "We'll figure this out, Lucy," Nick said softly, trying to reassure her, even as his own heart ached. "Worry. Right now, the most important thing is making sure Faith gets better." The doctor nodded in agreement. "We'll need to do a full neurological assessment to determine the extent of Faith's injuries. Possible that her memory loss is temporary and that she'll start to remember things as she heals. But there's also a chance that the damage could be more permanent." The words hung heavy in the air, and Nick felt as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulder. He had been through so much with Faith already. Her struggles with bullying, her battle with addiction, and now this. How much more could one family endure? As they wheeled Faith out of the room, Nick and Sharon exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were both terrified, but they also knew that they had to be strong, not just for Faith, but for each other. No matter what the future held, They would face it together. Lucy watched them go, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. She had never meant for any of this to happen, and the thought that her actions had led to Faith's suffering was almost too much to bear. She had been reckless, thinking only of herself, and now Faith was paying the price. As the hours passed, Nick and Sharon waited anxiously for news. The hospital was a maze of sterile corridors and impersonal waiting rooms, but to them it felt like a prison. Every minute that passed without word from the doctors was torture. Nick paced the floor, his thoughts racing, while Sharon sat quietly, lost in her own world of worry and fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned. His expression was grave, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Newman, we've completed the tests," he said, his tone professional but compassionate. "The good news is that Faith's physical injuries are not as severe as we initially feared. However, the memory loss, well, it's difficult to say at this point whether it will be temporary or permanent." Nick felt a pang of fear in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What do we do next?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "For now, we'll focus on her recovery. With time and the right support, there's a chance that her memories will return. But it's important that we don't push her too hard. She needs to feel safe and supported as she navigates this difficult time." Sharon nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We just want her to be okay." As they returned to Faith's room, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Faith was alive, but she was not the same girl they had known. She was a stranger in her own life, disconnected from the people who loved her most. It was a heartbreaking thought, but Nick knew that they had to hold on to hope. Faith was strong. She had proven that time and time again, and if anyone could overcome this, it was her. In the days that followed, Nick and Sharon devoted themselves to Faith's recovery. They spoke to her gently, reminding her of who she was, the life she had lived before the accident. But no matter how hard they tried, there was still a distance between them, a barrier created by the lost memories that separated Faith from her past. Lucy visited often, her guilt a constant companion. She wanted to help, to make amends for what had happened, but she wasn't sure how. Every time she looked at Faith, she was reminded of the accident, of the moment that had changed everything. But she refused to give up. She owed it to Faith to be there for her, to support her in any way she could. One afternoon, as Lucy sat by Faith's bedside, she took a deep breath and decided to come clean. "Faith," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something about the accident." Faith looked at her, her eyes still clouded with confusion, but there was a flicker of recognition there, something that gave Lucy hope. "What is it?" Faith asked, her voice soft and unsure. Lucy swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. "It was my fault," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was upset, and I wasn't paying attention. I distracted you, and that's why we crashed. I'm so sorry, Faith. I never meant for any of this to happen." For a moment there was silence as Faith processed Lucy's words. Then, to Lucy's surprise, Faith reached out and took her hand. "It's okay," Faith said quietly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't remember what happened, but I can tell you're sorry, and that's enough for me."